In the spring of 1940, as the German army moved toward Paris, a woman was buying art. She was 41 years old. For months, she had been living in France, watching the news from Germany, and she understood, with the clarity of a woman who had spent the previous decade in the European art world, what the Nazi regime was doing to the paintings and sculptures and objects that had been produced by the artists she knew and loved. She understood what was coming. She bought one picture a day. She bought Picasso and Braque and Ernst and Léger and de Chirico and Glazes and Masson and Breton and Giacometti and Miró and Tanguy. She bought them from artists who were fleeing and from dealers who were desperate and from collectors who needed cash more than they needed paintings. She bought them because she understood that the paintings, if left in France, would be confiscated by a regime that had defined modern art as degenerate, and that was already demonstrating what it did to degenerate things. She bought them because she had the money and the will and the understanding of what she was looking at. Her name was Peggy Guggenheim. Her uncle was Solomon Guggenheim, who was in New York building the most famous art museum in America, which would eventually bear his name. He did not help her get the paintings out of France. His foundation refused to assist. His advisor, Hilla Rebay, the German-born painter who had shaped Solomon's collection, and who ran his foundation with the specific authority of someone who is convinced a wealthy patron that her taste is his taste, had spent years dismissing Peggy's gallery as a commercial shop and Peggy herself as an embarrassment to the Guggenheim name. When Peggy needed help, the family establishment was not there. She got the paintings out herself. She shipped them to New York, labeled as household goods. She got herself out by the last available route. She arrived in America with 200 works of modern art and the understanding that she had just done something the family establishment had declined to do. Now here is the question this video is going to answer. Peggy Guggenheim spent her life being told she was not quite a Guggenheim, not quite wealthy enough. Her father had walked away from the family business and lost his money, and the inheritance she received was a fraction of what her uncles commanded. Not quite respectable enough, and she had married a bohemian and lived openly and taken lovers and run a gallery that her uncle's people called a social cancer. Not quite serious enough. Her collection was of modern art, work by living artists that the establishment could not yet assess, work that Solomon's institution had decided was beneath its attention. She was, in the family's accounting, the lesser Guggenheim, the embarrassing one. The one whose gallery was named Guggenheim Jeune, Guggenheim the Younger, her own ironic jab at Solomon's grander institution across the Atlantic. The question is what you do when the family decides you are the wrong kind. What you build when the institution that bears your name refuses to recognize what you are building. What it means to save something, to literally rescue a century's worth of the most important art in the world from the Nazis, while your family's foundation declines to help. The question is what she bought them all for. Drop your city in the comments, and if these stories matter to you, subscribe. Now let us go back to New York in 1898, to the house on Fifth Avenue, where a girl was born into the most complicated position available to a woman of her era, the wrong kind of rich. Meyer Guggenheim came to America from the canton of Aargau in Switzerland in 1848 with roughly $30 and a trade as a peddler. He was 22 years old. He sold shoelaces and stove polish and small household goods through the German-speaking communities of Pennsylvania, working his way up through a succession of small businesses, a lye manufacturing operation, a stove polish company, until a chance investment in a Colorado silver mine in 1880 changed the entire trajectory. The mine was the AY and Mini Mine near Leadville. It paid out at a rate that made the investment one of the most fortuitous in the history of American mining. Meyer Guggenheim had become rich. He converted the mine profits into more mines and then into smelters, the processing facilities that extracted the metal from the ore, and then into the American Smelting and Refining Company, which eventually controlled a substantial fraction of the American metals industry. He organized his 7 sons into the enterprise in a way that made the family the unit of competition rather than the individual. The Guggenheims competed as a family against the world, which was a strategy that converted a modest immigrant fortune into one of the great industrial dynasties of the Gilded Age. He gave his sons the maxim of the family enterprise in a story that the family told for generations. He gave each boy a stick and asked them to break it. Each broke his own stick easily. Then he bound 7 sticks together and asked them to break the bundle. None could. The bundle, he told them, was the family. The Guggenheims were the bundle. Benjamin was the 5th son. He had the charm and the intelligence of his father, but not the discipline, or perhaps not the patience, for the specific grinding enterprise of running a smelting company. He stayed in the family business until 1910, when he terminated his partnership rights and struck out on his own with the Paris elevator scheme. He gave up the bundle in exchange for the specific freedom of a man who preferred his own ventures to the family ones. The bundle had been his protection. Without it, he was vulnerable. When the elevator company failed and Benjamin's personal fortune was depleted, he was no longer protected by the Guggenheim enterprise. He had voluntarily removed himself from the network of family capital and family relationships that had made the name valuable. He was on his own when the Titanic sailed. Joseph Seligman was the grandfather Peggy never met, the man whose story was the other half of the family mythology that produced her. He had come to America in 1837 from Bayersdorf in Bavaria, one of 8 brothers who emigrated together and who built, collectively, one of the most significant banking houses in 19th century America. Joseph was the eldest and the most commercially brilliant. By the time of the Civil War, J&W Seligman & Co. was one of the primary financial institutions managing the Union government's need for capital. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase relied on the Seligman network to distribute Union war bonds in Europe to convince the German and English banking houses that the Union would survive and that its bonds were worth holding. The commission was immense. The significance was larger than the commission. When the war ended, Joseph Seligman was one of the most celebrated men in America. President Grant offered him the position of Secretary of the Treasury. He declined. In 1877, Joseph Seligman arrived with his family at the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, New York, where he and his family had vacationed for years. The hotel's manager, a man named Henry Hilton, who had acquired it from the estate of A.T. Stewart, met them at the door. Hilton told Seligman that Jews were no longer welcome at the hotel. Israelites, he used. As a class, he said. Seligman left. He wrote about the encounter. The newspapers covered it with the intensity that the combination of a famous man and a visible act of bigotry reliably produces. The story became one of the defining incidents of American anti-Semitism in the Gilded Age, the moment when the exclusion that had always been practiced in the drawing rooms and the clubs and the summer resorts became a matter of public record, when the polite agreement to keep Jewish families out of the institutions they could otherwise afford became something that had to be defended in print. Hilton defended it. He wrote letters explaining his reasoning. The reasoning was the reasoning of the era, that the presence of Jewish guests disturbed other guests, that a hotel had the right to choose its clientele, that this was business rather than prejudice. The boycott of A.T. Stewart's department store that followed was one of the first organized Jewish American responses to public anti-Semitism. It was effective. The store declined. Joseph Seligman died in 1880. His daughter Florette, Peggy's mother, grew up in the aftermath of this story. In the position of a family that was among the richest in America and that had been publicly told, at the height of its prosperity, that it was the wrong kind of people. Florette's response to growing up in this position was to organize her social life entirely around assimilation, around demonstrating, through every choice of household and furniture and social affiliation, that the Seligman family belonged in the world that had tried to exclude it. This organizing principle produced a woman who was intensely concerned with appearances and entirely disinterested in the interior lives of her children, for whom the children were primarily social instruments rather than people to be known. It also produced in Peggy an understanding of what it meant to be told you were the wrong kind of something. The Guggenheims had told Benjamin's daughter she was the wrong kind of Guggenheim. The Grand Union Hotel had told the Seligmans they were the wrong kind of people. The experience of exclusion was hereditary in this family, passed from generation to generation in the form available to each generation's circumstances. Peggy converted it, as her grandfather had converted the Civil War, into something that outlasted the exclusion. The Seligman family was excluded from Saratoga Springs. Peggy was excluded from the Guggenheim establishment. Both of them built something that the people who excluded them had to reckon with eventually. Marguerite Guggenheim was born on August 26, 1898 in New York City, the second daughter of Benjamin Guggenheim and Florette Seligman. Both families were among the most powerful in America. The Guggenheims had built their fortune in mining and smelting. Meyer Guggenheim, the patriarch, had come from Switzerland in 1848 with almost nothing and had converted his labor and intelligence into a family enterprise that controlled much of the American copper and silver industry by the time his sons were grown. Meyer had 7 sons, and he kept them in the business together, which was the Guggenheim method. The money worked together, the decisions were made together, the family was the enterprise. Benjamin was the 5th son. He had the Guggenheim energy and the Guggenheim charm, but not ultimately the Guggenheim discipline. He prospered in the family enterprise and then walked away from it in 1910, giving up his rights to the family partnership to pursue his own investments. The primary investment was a company that wanted to manufacture and install elevators in the buildings of Paris and the Eiffel Tower. The investment was not successful. By the time Benjamin boarded the Titanic in 1912, he had lost most of the money he had taken out of the family partnership. Florette Seligman was the daughter of Joseph Seligman, the banker who had been the primary financier of the Union side of the Civil War and who had been, for a time, the most famous Jewish American in the country. The Seligman family had its own version of the Guggenheim story, like Mikot Sikar Australis Alza Emielvitz, a Guggenheim immigrant ambition converted into extraordinary wealth through a combination of intelligence and timing and the willingness to take risks at moments when risk was available. Florette had grown up in one of the most affluent households in New York and had married into another. She was also neglectful, by every account including her daughters. Peggy described her childhood as guilt-edged but lonely. Her parents were present in the social sense and absent in the personal sense, her father charming and peripatetic, her mother concerned with her own social world, rather than the interior lives of the 3 daughters who were managed by governesses and servants while their parents performed the Gilded Age version of parenthood. Peggy doted on her father. He was everything her mother was not, attentive, amusing, demonstrative with his affection. He took the girls to the theater. He told stories. He was the warmth in the household. He died in the North Atlantic on April 15, 1912. Peggy's nose was a fact of her life from adolescence onward. It was large. It was, as she described it herself, a potato nose. Bulbous at the tip, the kind of nose that the camera and the eye both register. She was, by other measures, attractive. Fine eyes, good bone structure, and animated face that the photographs of her middle age show as interesting and alive. But the nose was what she saw when she looked in the mirror, and what she feared other people saw when they looked at her. And the fear organized her relationship to her own appearance in ways that never fully resolved. In her early 20s, she went to a surgeon and asked for a rhinoplasty. The surgery was performed. The nose it produced was, by most accounts including her own, worse than the nose that had gone in. It was thinner at the tip, but the improvement was not what she had hoped for, and the result was a nose that she continued to be self-conscious about for the rest of her life. She learned to be photographed from her good side. She learned to manage the angle. She learned the arts of presentation that women who are unhappy with their faces learn. The pose, the hat, the expression that draws the eye away from what it might otherwise rest on. She also, eventually, stopped caring in the way that a person stops caring when the caring has gone on long enough that it becomes boring even to the person doing the caring. She kept the nose. She lived with it. She was photographed with it and written about with it, and the photographs and the articles that treated it as one of her defining characteristics were part of the price of being Peggy Guggenheim, which she paid because the alternative, not being Peggy Guggenheim, was not available. Her insecurity about her appearance was real and persistent. Whether it accounts, as some of her biographers have argued, for the relentless pursuit of men who found her desirable. The counting of lovers, the need to be wanted physically as compensation for the feeling of being not quite right physically, is a psychological argument that the evidence supports without fully confirming. What is clear is that Peggy spent her adult life in the situation of a woman who did not feel she was beautiful enough to be loved for her beauty, and who consequently needed to find other grounds for being loved. The art was one ground, the money was another. The intelligence and the humor and the ease in the bohemian world that she had made her world were others. She collected. She was collected. Both were forms of the same need. Peggy Guggenheim arrived in Europe in 1921 and did not come home for 20 years. She was 23 years old. She had grown up in New York, been educated at the Jacobi School, and then at the Ferrer Center, the anarchist school in Greenwich Village where Emma Goldman lectured and where the children of the bohemian intelligentsia received the education that the conventional schools of the era declined to provide. She had worked briefly at a bookstore in New York called the Sunwise Turn, which was one of the gathering places of the village literary world, and where she had first understood that the world she wanted was not the world she had grown up in. The village had taught her the vocabulary. Europe would give her the substance. She went first to London and then to Paris, and Paris in 1921 was the intersection of time and place and generation that produces, once in a historical epoch, a world in which the art being made is the most important art of the century, and the people making it are available to be known in person, and the cafes where they gather are the places where the decisions about what the century will care about are being argued. She was there for it. Not as a collector yet. She did not begin collecting in any serious sense until the late 1930s, but as a person who was paying attention, who was learning to distinguish what mattered from what merely seemed to matter, who was developing the eye that would eventually allow her to look at a Pollock in 1943 and understand what she was seeing. She lived on the left bank. She knew Jeune Barnes, who was writing the work that would eventually be published as Nightwood. She knew Mina Loy, the poet. She knew Isadora Duncan, who was in Paris dancing and teaching and living the version of artistic freedom that the early 20th century offered to women who were willing to pay the price of it. She knew Gertrude Stein, who was on the right bank and who received visitors on Saturday evenings in a salon that was one of the primary institutions of the Parisian avant-garde. She was learning, in these years, what it meant to take art seriously. Not as decoration, not as investment, not as the expression of social position that the collecting of the rich traditionally represents, but as a practice, a commitment, a form of attention to the world that produces, in the people who pursue it, a different relationship to what they see. This education was not systematic. It was the education of proximity, of being in the rooms where the work was being made and the arguments about what the work meant were being had, of listening and watching and developing slowly the judgment that proximity to serious people and serious work produces. She also, in these years, fell in love repeatedly and badly, as young women who have grown up without adequate parenting and without any knowledge of what love looks like in a functional form tend to do. She fell in love with men who were interesting and who did not love her well. She fell in love with situations that looked like love and turned out to be something else. She was learning. The learning was expensive. She paid for it in the currency of her 20s, which is the only currency available for that kind of education. The Titanic sank at approximately 2:20 in the morning of April 15, 1912. Benjamin Guggenheim was 46 years old. He was traveling with his valet Victor Guillot and his mistress, a French singer named Leontine Aubert, and her maid. He had been living in Paris managing the failing elevator business and was returning to New York. When the ship began to take on water, he put Leontine Aubert and her maid into a lifeboat. Then he and his valet, understanding that the ship was going down and that there were not enough lifeboats for the men, went below to dress. They came back to the deck in their white tie and evening clothes, their formal wear, the dress appropriate for a gentleman. He told a surviving passenger to give a message to his wife. Tell her that Benjamin played the game out straight and to the end. No woman was left on board because Benjamin Guggenheim was a coward. He went down with the ship. Peggy was 13 years old. She described the months that followed as a nervous breakdown, the description of a 13-year-old who had lost the parent she loved and who was now in a household with a mother who had never been emotionally present and who was now lost in her own grief. The household moved to smaller quarters. The uncles, The brothers who had stayed in the Guggenheim partnership while Benjamin had walked away convened to determine what the widow and the three daughters needed and what could be provided. What could be provided was less than it would have been if Benjamin had stayed in the partnership. His fortune, which had been substantial when he left the family business, had been substantially reduced by the failed elevator company. The trust fund that was established for Peggy and her sisters, worth approximately $450,000, produced a yearly income of approximately $22,000, a sum that was more than adequate by ordinary standards, and that was, by Guggenheim family standards, modest. It produced in Peggy a self-consciousness that would organize her relationship to money and to the family name for the rest of her life. She came to think of herself, she later wrote, as no longer a real Guggenheim. She was right that she was not the same kind of Guggenheim as her uncles. She was wrong about what kind of Guggenheim she was. The war between Peggy Guggenheim and the Guggenheim establishment was not declared. It accumulated the way the distance between a person and the institution that bears their name accumulates, incident by incident, slight by slight, until the distance is the relationship. The establishment was Solomon R. Guggenheim, and his foundation and his advisor Hilla Rebay von Ehrenwiesen, and the museum that would eventually bear Solomon's name on Fifth Avenue in New York. Solomon was the third of Meyer's 7 sons. He had made his money in the mining and smelting enterprise, and had, in his later years, turned his attention to art, to the abstract art of the early 20th century, specifically to the non-objective painting that Hilla Rebay had introduced him to and that it pursued with the evangelical conviction of people who believe they have found the only true form of aesthetic expression. Hilla Rebay was not modest about this conviction. She believed that non-objective art was not simply a style, but a spiritual force, that the paintings she and Solomon collected were not decorative objects, but instruments of a higher consciousness that the world required. She ran it with corresponding intensity. She decided what was collected, how it was displayed, who was granted access, and who was not. She decided that Peggy was not. When Peggy opened Guggenheim Jeune in London in 1938, the gallery she had conceived with the help of Marcel Duchamp, named to distinguish it from her uncle's more established foundation, Rebay's response was immediate and hostile. She wrote to Peggy that she was showing a disrespect to Solomon Guggenheim, and that it was a social cancer, and that Peggy was cheapening the Guggenheim name by running a commercial enterprise. She pressured Solomon to intervene. Solomon, who was in his late 70s and whose judgment was increasingly filtered through Rebay's, largely declined to acknowledge his niece's existence. The family that could have helped, that had the resources and the institutional relationships and the name, turned its back. Peggy kept it open. Ausgerstras. Hilla Rebay von Ehrenwiesen deserves her own accounting, because without understanding who she was and what she believed, her antagonism toward Peggy is incomprehensible. She was born in 1890 in Strasbourg, the daughter of a Prussian general. She had studied painting in Paris and Cologne and Munich and had developed in those years a commitment to non-objective art, the abstract painting that had no representational content, that referred to nothing in the physical world, but existed as pure form and color and relationship. That was for her not aesthetic preference, but spiritual conviction. She met Solomon Guggenheim at a portrait sitting in 1927. He was 66 years old. She was 37. She painted his portrait, and then she told him about non-objective art, and something in the combination of her certainty and the paintings she showed him connected with whatever in Solomon Guggenheim was looking for a purpose for the fortune that the mining and smelting had produced. He became, under her guidance, one of the most important patrons of non-objective art in the world. He funded her vision. He bought the paintings she selected. He built the museum she designed. The Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which opened in 1939 and rented space on East 54th Street, was an expression of Rebay's philosophy as much as Solomon's money. She determined the collection, designed the installation, wrote the catalog essays, decided who was granted access and who was not. Her certainty was absolute. She believed that non-objective art was the spiritual art of the future, that representational painting was a lower form, that the surrealism and the cubism and the social realism that were the dominant modes of the European avant-garde were beneath serious attention. She had identified the true form of art, and she was devoting her life to its promotion. This certainty made her a remarkable museum director. It also made her contemptuous of everything outside the narrow band of work she considered significant. Peggy's gallery represented everything Rebay found contemptible. It showed surrealism and cubism and Dada, the movements that Rebay had decided were not serious art. It showed living artists whose reputations were not yet established, rather than the canonical figures of pure abstraction that the Foundation had collected. It operated as a commercial gallery rather than a temple of the non-objective. It sold work, it charged admission, it participated in the market. When Peggy had written to Rebay in 1937, 2 years before opening the gallery, to ask for guidance about forming a collection, a letter that was in every way the approach of a younger relative seeking the advice of an established authority, Rebay had responded with a contempt so complete that Peggy later described it as the beginning of her real education. Rebay had told her she had no soul and that she would never understand art, and that her plan to open a gallery was an imposition on the serious world it represented. This was the woman who ran Solomon's museum. This was the woman who told Peggy she was showing a disrespect to Solomon and that her gallery was a social cancer. Peggy's response to this contempt was to open the best gallery in London and then to buy the most important collection of modern art assembled during the Second World War. In retrospect, the contempt was a gift. It clarified the opposition and freed her to define herself against it rather than in relation to it. The Guggenheim name that Rebay had weaponized against her became, in the end, the name on the museum in Venice. Rebay lived until 1967. She died in Westport, Connecticut, having been dismissed from the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation after Solomon's death in 1949. When the foundation's new leadership recognized that her management had been erratic and her collection of Rudolf Bauer, an artist to whom she had personal and possibly romantic attachment and whose work she had purchased in enormous quantities, had been a significant misallocation of the museum's resources. Bauer is not in the canon, Pollock is. Peggy had known which was which 20 years before the institutions confirmed it. Lawrence Vail was the first husband, married in 1922. He was an American writer living in Paris, the kind of American writer who was in Paris in the early 1920s because Paris was where the Americans who were becoming the literature of their time had gathered, drawn by the exchange rate and the freedom and the sense that something was happening in the cafes and the apartments and the gardens that was not happening in the country they had left behind. He was in the circle of Gertrude Stein and Jeune Barnes and James Joyce and the others. He was charming in the way that the accounts of him consistently describe, physically striking, verbally sharp, socially magnetic. He was also violent. This is the word that appears in the accounts of people who knew the marriage, not the Victorian euphemism of difficult or volatile, but violent. He threw things. He hit. He was, in the vocabulary that was not yet available to the era, abusive in the patterns that are now recognizable as the patterns of intimate partner violence, the charm and the cruelty alternating, the public performance of devotion, and the private practice of something else. Peggy stayed for approximately 6 years. She had the children, Sinbad in 1923, Pegeen in 1925. The Paris life, the connections, and the understanding developing slowly that the marriage was costing her more than it was providing. She left. The divorce was messy in the way of divorces involving children and money and the bitterness of people who had invested in something that had failed. Lawrence kept various custody arrangements with the children over the years. Peggy had both children, and neither parent was what the children needed. Sinbad, Michael Cedric. Sinbad Vail grew up with the peripatetic instability of parents who were each committed to their own lives in ways that left the children as secondary concerns. He eventually made his life in France. He outlived his mother. Pegeen did not. The lovers were many, and the accounts of them fill the biographies of Peggy Guggenheim with names and episodes and the texture of a life conducted at the intersection of artistic brilliance and personal chaos. Samuel Beckett came and went in the winter of 1937-1938, in the months before she opened Guggenheim Jeune. He was 31 years old, living in Paris, still years away from the work that would make him one of the most important writers of the century. He had been stabbed in the street by a stranger earlier that year. A random encounter with a man later identified as a pimp, who stabbed him in the chest without apparent motive and ran. Joyce had visited him in the hospital. When Beckett met Peggy, he was recovering from this attack, still living the marginal life of a young writer who has not yet found his subject, teaching English to survive and spending his time in the cafes and galleries where the European avant-garde made its daily life. They became lovers. He was, she said later, the most intelligent man she had ever been with, a quality that she valued above the others, that the intelligence was real and engaged and not performing. He helped her think about what the gallery should show and why. She gave him money when he needed it, which was regularly. The relationship ended, as Beckett's relationships tended to end, when the intensity became too much for him to sustain, and he retreated into the privacy that was his primary requirement. They remained friends. He attended the opening of Guggenheim Jeune. When Beckett eventually became famous and the world came to understand what she had known in those winter months in Paris, she was proud of the friendship in the quiet way of people who knew something before the world did. Max Ernst was the second husband, married in 1941. He was a surrealist painter of the first rank, one of the inventors of the movement, the man whose collages and paintings and frottages had defined a style that was both technically innovative and psychologically disturbing in ways that made the work difficult to dismiss. He was also, at the moment of the marriage, a man who needed to get out of France. He was German, he was Jewish. He had been interned by the French government as an enemy alien at the start of the war and had escaped. He needed American papers. Peggy helped him get American papers. They married in 1941. They were in America together for 5 years, and the marriage was, by her account, and by the accounts of everyone who observed it, something short of love on his part, and something considerably more than that on hers. He found her useful. She found him compelling. He left her for Dorothea Tanning, the painter whom he married in 1946 and with whom he lived for the rest of his life. She was not destroyed by this. She had survived Lawrence Vale. She had the art and the collection. She converted what might have been devastation into forward motion, the way she had learned to convert everything. She converted it into Venice. The gallery at Cork Street in London was not, in the event, a social cancer. It was one of the most important galleries in England in the 18 months it operated, the place where the work of Wassily Kandinsky was shown in its first major British exhibition, where Yves Tanguy had his first London show, where Jean Cocteau and Samuel Beckett and Herbert Reed and the painters and poets who constituted the European avant-garde gathered because Peggy had made the gallery the place they gathered. She had done this not through her Guggenheim money. The actual resources were modest, and she was famously careful with them, but through her intelligence about the work and her connections to the artists and her willingness to take the painting seriously that the institutional world had not yet decided to take seriously. She also, in this period, had an affair with Samuel Beckett. It lasted several months and produced in Beckett, who had not yet written the work that would make him famous, a devoted friendship that persisted long after the affair had ended. He helped her think about art. She helped him survive the winter financially. They were, by the accounts of both, genuinely fond of each other in the way of people who meet before they have become what they will become, and who recognize something real in each other before either has learned to perform the self they will eventually be known as. He would not write Waiting for Godot for another decade. She would not arrive in Venice for another decade. Both of them were becoming what they would be, in the way of people who are in the middle of the process and who do not know yet what the end looks like. She closed the gallery when the escalating situation in Europe made continuation impossible. Over 20 exhibitions in 18 months. She showed the work that the institutions were not yet showing. She did this in London with modest resources, while her uncle's foundation in New York was building the institutional infrastructure for a museum that would carry his name. She was not bitter about this, or rather, she was exactly as bitter as a person is entitled to be when the institution that bears her family name refuses to acknowledge what she is doing and she converted that bitterness, as she converted most things, into forward motion. The year 1939 was the year the world changed, and Peggy Guggenheim's response to the world changing was to buy more art. She was in Paris by the time war was declared. She had been advised by Herbert Reed, the British art critic who had helped her think about the London Gallery, to establish a museum of modern art in London. The war made London impossible. Paris was where the art was, and Paris was where she stayed as long as staying was possible. She had a list. She had been working on the list for months, a systematic catalog of the artists whose work she wanted to acquire, the paintings and sculptures that represented the full range of what the 20th century had produced. She bought Cubism and Surrealism and Abstract Expressionism. She bought from artists who were still in France and who were frightened. She bought from dealers who understood that the Germans were coming and that what they were coming for would be confiscated. She bought one picture a day. She paid for many of them at prices that were a fraction of what they would eventually be worth. This has produced in the subsequent accounts of her collecting a certain emphasis on her commercial astuteness. The suggestion that she was buying cheaply from desperate people in a moment of crisis. This framing misses what she was actually doing. The value of the paintings in 1940 was genuinely uncertain. These were works by living artists whose reputations were still forming, and the price that a Picasso or a Léger or a Braque commanded in 1940 was not the price those names would command in 1960. She was not simply opportunistic. She was a person who had spent years developing a genuine understanding of what the work meant and who was willing to act on that understanding in circumstances that required acting quickly. She also tried to acquire works from the Louvre. She approached the museum about acquiring works from the collection of modern and contemporary art that they were considering evacuating. The Louvre declined. The paintings in the Louvre's collection that might have been saved through sale to a private collector who had demonstrated the ability to get art out of France were not sold. Peggy got her own out. She shipped them to New York, labeled as household goods. She escaped through Spain and Portugal. She arrived in New York in 1941 with approximately 200 works of modern art, the most significant private collection of 20th century modernism that had yet been assembled, save from the wreckage of the European art world. Her uncle's foundation had not helped. Art of this Century opened on October 20th, 1942, at 30 West 57th Street in New York City. The gallery was designed by the architect Frederick Kiesler, who created for it an environment that was unlike anything the New York art world had seen. Curved walls with paintings suspended on cables rather than hung flat, biomorphic furniture. Different rooms in different styles. The whole thing organized around the idea that the experience of looking at art should be an experience in itself rather than a neutral background for objects. It was the most radical gallery space in New York. The gallery showed the European modernists that Peggy had collected in Europe. It also showed the Americans, the painters who were in the process of creating what would eventually be recognized as the most significant development in 20th century American art, the abstract expressionism that emerged from New York in the 1940s, and that would make American painting the dominant force in world art for the following generation. She showed them before they were recognized. Jackson Pollock had his first solo exhibition at Art of this Century in 1943. She had been introduced to him by Mondrian, who had told her the young painter was the most interesting talent he had seen in America. She gave Pollock a monthly stipend and a contract. She showed the paintings. The paintings made a painter who had been known only in a small circle of artists and critics into someone the larger world would eventually have to reckon with. She also showed William Beziotes, Robert Motherwell, Clifford Still, Mark Rothko, and Hans Hofmann. Painters who are in every account of 20th century American art, whose work hangs in every major museum in the world, whose names are on the buildings and the wings and the endowments that the institutional art world eventually constructed around their reputations. Peggy showed them when they were unknown. She paid for their stipends when they had no other income. She gave them the wall space and the catalog essays and the critical attention of the people who came to the gallery and who were, in some cases, the critics who would later write the history that these painters would inhabit. She was doing what her uncle's foundation, with its vastly greater resources, was not doing. Solomon's collection focused on the European abstraction that Hilla Rebay had directed him toward, the non-objective painting of Kandinsky and Moholy-Nagy and Rudolf Bauer. It did not collect the Americans. It did not show Pollock. It did not give Rothko his first exhibition. Peggy did those things. With her modest inheritance and her own eyes and her willingness to trust what she was looking at, rather than waiting for the institutional validation that would make the looking safe. She closed Art of this Century in 1947. She had been in New York for 6 years, and she was tired of New York, and she was tired of the American art world, and she was, by all accounts, somewhat tired of the exhaustion of being a woman doing serious work in a field that did not yet fully accept that women could do serious work in it. She went to Venice. Jackson Pollock's first solo exhibition at Art of this Century opened on November 9, 1943. He was 31 years old. He was working as a maintenance man at the Museum of Non-Objective Art, Solomon Guggenheim's museum, where Hilla Rebay ran the collection with evangelical certainty about the non-objective painting that the museum promoted. Pollock mopped the floors. He was paid $12 a week. He had been introduced to Peggy by Piet Mondrian, who had seen the paintings at a group exhibition at Art of this Century earlier that year and had told Peggy that she should pay attention to this young painter. Mondrian was not a man who gave such opinions lightly. Peggy went to Pollock's studio on 8th Street and looked at the paintings and understood what Mondrian had understood. She gave Pollock a monthly stipend of $150 and a contract for 4 paintings a year. She gave him the first solo show. She gave him the wall space and the catalog and the critical attention that came with showing at the gallery that the New York art world was paying attention to. The exhibition attracted reviews that were mixed to negative. The critics had not yet developed the vocabulary for what they were looking at. The paintings were large and turbulent, and unlike what painting was supposed to look like, dripped and poured and structured by a logic that was not the logic of European modernism, but something else, something that would eventually be recognized as the beginning of the most significant development in American art history. Peggy saw it before the vocabulary existed. She supported Pollock for 4 years. She gave him the shows and the stipend and the promotional attention that his work needed to reach the audience that would eventually make him famous. When she closed Art of this Century in 1947 and went to Venice, she assigned him a remaining contract for an additional painting a year. When that contract ended, he was well enough established to manage without her support. He died in a car accident in 1956. He was 44 years old. The paintings he had made, which Peggy had supported through the years when making them was all he had, are now among the most valuable in the world. The one she kept, which hangs in Venice, is called Alchemy. It was made in 1947. It is approximately 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, a field of poured and dripped paint in browns and blacks and yellows and whites, a kind of controlled chaos that the eye cannot fully resolve into pattern, no matter how long it looks. It is one of the great paintings of the 20th century. It is in Venice, in the Palazzo Finito, in the garden where Peggy is buried. She saw what it was before anyone else was seeing it. She kept it her entire life. That is what the one picture-a-day collector was buying. Not objects, the future. The Palazzo Venier de Leoni sits lower than every other palace on the Grand Canal because it was never finished. It was begun in the 18th century by the Venier family, one of the great Venetian noble families, and the construction stopped after the first floor was complete and never resumed. The stories about why the construction stopped vary. Money, a neighbor's legal objection, a change in the family's fortunes. And the truth is probably less dramatic than the stories suggest. The construction stopped because construction stopped, and the building remained at one story while the other palaces rose around it, and eventually it became known as Il Palazzo Non Finito, the unfinished palace. Peggy bought it in 1949 for $60,000. She renovated over several years, installing the collection on the ground floor and in the garden, living in the upper rooms, working in the spaces between. She opened the garden on Sunday afternoons in summer, accessible to anyone who found the low white building with the terrace facing the canal. The garden faced the canal directly. There was no embankment between the building and the water, just the terrace at water level and the Grand Canal a few feet away. and the boats and gondolas passing on the water and the light from the water on the underside of the terrace roof. It was one of the most beautiful positions on the most beautiful waterway in Europe. She bought a gondola, she received visitors, she worked, acquiring, cataloging, lending to exhibitions, corresponding with the artists and curators and critics who were now in the 1950s beginning to understand what she had assembled. The artists she had championed in London and New York in the late 1930s and early 1940s were now recognized. Pollock was famous. Rothko was recognized. The abstract expressionist movement that she had supported in its earliest phase was now the dominant force in international art. She had been right. She had been right before the institutions confirmed she was right, which is the only time it matters to be right. She wore enormous butterfly-shaped sunglasses, a pair designed by Edward Melcarth that she had adopted as her signature. And she sat on the terrace and received the world, and was received by it. She was photographed countless times. She was written about. She was documented. She was, in Venice, the thing that she had always wanted to be. The person whose choices were recognized as choices rather than eccentricities. The person whose collection was acknowledged as a collection rather than a commercial shop. The person whose life, which had been described by her family's establishment as an embarrassment, was now recognized as the life that had produced one of the great cultural monuments of the century. E mia naprosa sempre saiu. The Venice that Peggy Guggenheim inhabited was not the tourist Venice of the Vaporetto routes and the overcrowded piazzas, though it contained both. It was the Venice of the winter months, when the city's population reduced to its actual residents, and the intimacy of a city built on water asserted itself. The sound of footsteps on stone and the sound of water against stone. The absence of automobile noise that made Venice the only major European city where the acoustic environment of the 19th century was still available. She knew the city as a resident rather than a visitor. She knew which traghetto crossed the Grand Canal at which point and at what hours. She knew the Accademia and the Peggy Guggenheim collection opening hours and the seasonal rhythms of the Biennale, which brought the international art world to Venice every 2 years in a concentration of dealers and curators and artists and critics that made the city, during those months, the center of the contemporary art conversation. She participated in this world with the ease of the person who hosts the party, rather than attends it. The Palazzo was the destination. The garden was where the serious conversations happened, where the people who wanted to talk about the work, rather than about the scene, gathered around the hostess in the butterfly sunglasses, and found that the hostess knew more about the work than most of them did. She entertained with the generosity of someone who had discovered, after the years of searching, what she was actually good at. She was good at making a room interesting. She was good at putting the right people in conversation with each other and then staying out of the way of the conversation. She was good at making the art visible, at creating the conditions in which the paintings could be seen, rather than simply looked at. Artists came. Alexander Calder, whose mobile sculpture she had collected, visited and stayed for extended periods. Francis Bacon, whose figurative work was the opposite of the non-objective painting that Rebay had championed, came to Venice and spent time in the garden with the collection, and with Peggy. Jean Arp, Marcel Duchamp, the people who had been present for the creation of the movements that the collection contained, came to see what had become of what they had made. She also received the next generation, the painters and sculptors who had grown up with the abstract expressionism that Peggy had championed in New York, and who now came to Venice to see the collection that had helped make their world possible. Tennessee Williams came, Truman Capote came, Gore Vidal came. The American writers who had found in Europe the distance from America that their work required spent time in Venice in these years, and some of them found their way to the terrace and to the hostess in the butterfly sunglasses, who had known Beckett before waiting for Godot and Ernst before his reputation had solidified, and Pollock before the drip paintings had a name. She had been there first. This was always her credential. Not the Guggenheim name, not the money, not the rhinoplasty that hadn't worked. The fact of having been there first, of having seen what was coming before the institutions confirmed it was coming, of having been right about the things that mattered before being right, was easy or profitable or socially approved. The Venetians adopted her in the way of a city that has absorbed foreigners for 1,000 years, and that knows the difference between the visitor who is passing through and the person who has chosen to stay. She was not Venetian. She was permanently a foreigner, which in Venice means permanently a guest at a very long party. But she was a guest who had brought the best collection in Italy, and the city understood the significance of what she had brought and was grateful for it. She rode her gondola. She bought her Lhasa Apsos from breeders she had cultivated over years. She received her visitors. She worked on the catalog of the collection, the definitive accounting of what she had assembled that she considered one of her most important contributions to the understanding of the work. She was in Venice exactly what she had always been and had never been allowed to be in the world that bore her family name. She was Peggy Guggenheim. That was enough. That was more than enough. She loved Venice. She had found, in the combination of the canal and the city and the art, the environment in which she was most fully herself. She was not, in Venice, the embarrassment that the Guggenheim establishment had made of her in New York. She was not the wrong kind of Guggenheim. She was the person who owned the palazzo on the Grand Canal and who had filled it with the most important art of the century. She received admirers and collectors and artists and curators and tourists. She received students and writers and poets. She received people who had heard about it and made their way there and who found, in the rooms full of art and in the garden overlooking the canal, that Peggy Guggenheim was not the eccentric bohemian that the family had described, but a woman of genuine intelligence and taste who had spent 30 years doing something that mattered. The dogs she had loved for decades were buried in the garden. She kept Lhasa Apsos her entire Venetian life, and the dogs that died were buried along the terrace wall, each with a small stone marking the name. She had arranged that she would be buried there too. She was. Pegeen Vail Guggenheim was born on August 22, 1925, the second child of Peggy and Lawrence Vail, the child who most resembled her mother, and who was, for that reason, both the child Peggy loved most completely and the child she understood least well. She began painting as a teenager. The paintings she made, small, intimate, often depicting domestic interiors and figures in rooms and women alone with objects, were the work of someone who had inherited her mother's eye and her mother's sensitivity, and who had not inherited whatever protected Peggy from the full weight of those qualities. Peggy's sensitivity had been armored over decades by the collecting and the forward motion and the converting of devastation into purpose. Pegeen's sensitivity had no such armor. She was exhibited. Peggy arranged shows of Pegeen's work in Paris and Venice using the connections she had built over 30 years to give her daughter the wall space and the critical attention that she had given to Pollock and Rothko and the others. The shows were well received by some critics and ignored by others. Pegeen was not Pollock. She was a painter of genuine sensibility working in a mode that the art world of the 1950s and 1960s found harder to categorize than the abstract expressionism that had become the dominant critical framework. She married 4 times. Jeune, the French abstract painter, was the first husband. They had met through Peggy's world, as Pegeen met most of the men she would marry, through the social world that her mother had built and that surrounded her from childhood. Ralph Rumney, the English artist who was one of the founders of the Situationist International, was among the later husbands. Each marriage was, by the accounts available, an attempt to find the stable center that her childhood had not provided, and that the subsequent marriages did not produce. She had 4 sons. She loved them. She was not consistently available to them in the way that love requires availability, because she was not consistently available to herself. Peggy was not a simple presence in her daughter's life. She was, by the accounts of people who knew both women, everything that a difficult mother is, demanding and loving and present, and interfering and supportive and undermining, all simultaneously. In the specific way of a woman who had never fully separated her own needs from her daughter's existence. She had given Pegeen the shows and the connections and the access to the world that Peggy's position made possible. She had also given her a childhood of peripatetic instability and the damage of growing up with a mother whose primary commitment was always, ultimately, to the art. Pegeen died on March 1, 1967, in the apartment she shared with her husband Ralph Rumney in the 15th arrondissement of Paris. She was 41 years old. The cause was recorded as an overdose of barbiturates. The circumstances pointed toward suicide. The family, Peggy and Lawrence both, maintained it was accidental. Whether it was accidental or not, Pegeen was dead at 41, which was younger than Benjamin had been when he went down with the Titanic. Younger than her mother had been during the Paris bombing in 1940. Young enough that the paintings she might have made in the subsequent decades do not exist. Peggy never recovered. This is not a figure of speech. She continued. She kept the palazzo, kept the dogs, kept receiving visitors. But the quality of her forward motion changed after Pegeen's death. The purpose that had organized her life for 40 years was still present, but the joy that had always been adjacent to the purpose was different now. She had built the collection to last. She had not been able to protect the thing she loved most. The paintings endure. The daughter is buried in Le Cannet, near Cannes, in the south of France. Peggy is buried in Venice with the dogs. They are in different countries. They are in the same story. She was, in these years, increasingly alone. The loneliness of Peggy Guggenheim's final years is the part of the story that the accounts of her collection and her collecting sometimes obscure. She had been looking for love for most of her adult life, with the same intensity she had brought to the search for art, and with considerably less success. The marriages had been disasters. Lawrence Vail, the first husband, was described by those who knew them as abusive, physically and emotionally volatile. The first in what Anton Gill's biography calls a succession of abusive men she seemed drawn to. The marriage lasted approximately 6 years and produced 2 children, Sinbad, born in 1923, and Pegeen, born in 1925. Pegeen was the child who most resembled her mother, artistic, sensitive, burdened by a version of Peggy's own longing for love that the circumstances of their lives had made unavailable. She became a painter. She had several marriages. She struggled. Pegeen Vail Guggenheim died on March 1, 1967 in Paris at the age of 41. The cause was reported as an overdose, the circumstances suggesting suicide, though the family maintained that it was accidental. She was 41 years old. Peggy had survived her daughter. She had survived her father on the Titanic and the failed rhinoplasty that left her nose worse than it had been, and the affairs with men who used her, and the marriage to Max Ernst, who had married her to escape wartime France and had left her for the painter Dorothea Tanning before the marriage was 3 years old. She had survived Beckett's friendship, ripening into distance as his work made him famous and his privacy became the requirement of his life. She had survived the institutional condescension of her uncle's foundation, and the war in Europe and the 6 years in New York, and the opening of art of this century, and the showing of Pollock and Rothko and the rest of them before anyone else was showing them. She had not survived her daughter's death in any of the ways that survive means something more than continuing. She continued. She kept the dogs. She kept receiving visitors. The dogs she had loved for decades were buried in the garden. She had kept Lhasa Apsos her entire Venetian life, and the dogs that died were buried along the terrace wall, and the little stones with their names were still there, and Peggy had arranged that she would be buried there too. She was. She died on December 23, 1979, in the hospital at Campo San Piero near Venice, aged 81. She had suffered a stroke 3 days earlier. She was buried in the garden, beside the dogs she had loved. Before she died, Peggy transferred the palazzo and the entire collection to the Solomon Guggenheim Foundation. The foundation that her uncle had built, the foundation whose director had called her gallery a social cancer, is now the institution that maintains what Peggy built. The Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice is one of the most visited museums in Italy and one of the most important collections of 20th century modern art in the world. The institution that would not help her get the paintings out of France now runs the museum that houses them. This is not irony exactly. It is the normal operation of institutional memory, in which the institution that outlasts the individual absorbs the individual's work and administers it with the authority that institutions provide. The Solomon Guggenheim Foundation is a good steward of what Peggy built. The paintings are maintained, it is open. The garden has the stones with the names of the dogs. But the institutional logic that makes the foundation the appropriate successor, The logic that says the family foundation should administer the family collection is the same logic that marginalized Peggy while she was building the collection. The institution that was too grand to help her, too committed to the serious, non-objective art of Kandinsky and Rebay to acknowledge what she was doing with Pollock and Ernst, now carries her name on a Venice waterfront. The foundation is on the building. She is in the garden. Her nose was never right after the rhinoplasty. She had tried to fix the potato nose she had been self-conscious about her entire life, and the surgery had made it worse, and she had spent the rest of her life being photographed from her good side, when there was a good side. She collected art compulsively, the way people who have been told they are not enough find something they can be enough at. She took lovers in numbers that the newspapers counted because the counting was how the world understood a woman who wanted love, and kept finding something adjacent to it, but not quite the thing itself. She wanted what everyone wants. She wanted to be seen for what she was, rather than for what the family had decided she was. The Guggenheim Jeune, the lesser one, the commercial one, the bohemian one, the social cancer. She was the one who bought one picture a day when the Germans were coming. She was the one who shipped the paintings out labeled as household goods. She was the one who gave Pollock his first show. She is in the garden in Venice with the dogs. The paintings are still there. The people who come to see them. The million or so people a year who visit the Palazzo Finito on the Grand Canal and stand in front of the Picasso and the Braque and the Ernst and the paintings that Peggy bought one per day as the Germans moved toward Paris. Those people are standing in what she built, not what the foundation built. What she built. The foundation came later. She came first. That is the story of the Guggenheim heiress they disowned for the life she chose. She chose the art. She chose the palazzo. She chose the dogs in the garden. She chose correctly. The collection is still there, still open, still hers.